The first thing I remember is the sound of the wind hitting the siding of our house in Lakeview, Wisconsin, sharp and angry, like it had been waiting for me. I stepped through the front door with my backpack still on my shoulder and snow melting down my sleeves, but before I could even pull my feet out of my boots, my dad was standing there in the entryway. His face was already set, cold, final, as if he had made up his mind long before I even touched the doorknob. He did not ask where I had been. He did not ask why I looked shaken, or why the storm was nearly swallowing the house whole. He only looked at me the way someone studies something broken. My 17-year-old self went still, sensing something was wrong, terribly wrong, but not yet knowing that my entire life was about to be rearranged in a single breath. He said he heard what I had done. He said I had embarrassed the family. He said I had tried to seduce my sister Ria's fiancé. He said he did not need a dirty daughter in his house. There was no warmth in his voice. Not even anger. It was almost calm, the way a judge reads a sentence they have no doubt about. I tried to speak, but my throat locked up. Snow dripped from my hair onto the floor. Behind him on the staircase, my mom stood halfway up, one hand resting on the railing. She did not come forward. She did not defend me. Her silence had always been loud, but that night it swallowed the entire hallway. And just behind my dad's shoulder, I saw Ria. My older sister, the one who used to braid my hair and bring me candy from the mall. She looked away when I met her eyes, not in guilt, in fear. Or maybe shame. Or maybe she had already chosen who she'd rather believe. Before I go any further, let me pause a moment. I always wonder what people are doing when they listen to stories like this. It makes a story feel a little more human when I picture someone folding laundry or sipping tea or winding down before bed. So if you feel like it, share it later in the comments. When all of this happened, I was standing right there in the doorway, snow in my boots, and it felt like the world tilted under my feet, even though the house was warm. I finally managed to say I had done nothing wrong. I tried to tell him I had only warned Ria because Julian had crossed boundaries with me and made comments that felt wrong. I tried to explain I had gone to her first, begging her to be careful, but she had gone to Julian instead, and he had twisted everything until he looked like the victim and I looked like a clip. Jealous teenager trying to ruin their engagement. My dad did not want to hear a word. He stepped closer, his voice rising for the first time that night. He said he would not hear lies under his roof. He said I should leave before he did something he would regret. He told me to get out of his house, and then he told me I was dead. The words hit harder because he said them almost gently. No shouting. No rage, just the kind of certainty that leaves no room to breathe. I felt the heat of shame crawl up my neck as if I had been caught doing something unspeakable. My heart hammered as if running, even though my body was frozen. My mom still did not move. Ria still did not speak, and I knew then that the three people who should have fought for me had already decided to let me go. I reached for my backpack because it was all I had. Inside was maybe a few changes of clothes, a handful of dollars I had earned stocking shelves after school, and a notebook where I tucked my plans for college someday. My dad opened the door behind me before I even turned around. The storm was louder now, the wind pushing through the doorway, cold and biting, carrying flakes of snow onto the hardwood floor. I tried once more to say I did not do what Julian claimed. I told him he could ask him again. I told him he could check my phone. I told him he could talk to me. Just talk to me like a daughter. But I could see in his eyes that he had already traded me for the story he preferred. A story where he had a perfect older daughter, a perfect future son-in-law, and a younger daughter who caused all the trouble. A story where throwing me out was easier than considering I might be telling the truth. He pushed the door wider. The wind slapped against my face. My mom's hand clenched the railing, but she did not speak, and Ria turned away like she could not stand to watch the scene she had helped create. My dad's voice was the last thing I heard before the door slammed behind me. He said I had made my choice, but deep down, I knew it was his choice that had been made long before I walked through that door. The moment the lock clicked, the house behind me glowed warm through the windows, and I stood alone in the storm. The snow reached my ankles within seconds. My coat was too thin. My hands were already numb. I had no phone charged, no car, no plan, and no family willing to hear me out. All I had was that backpack and the few $100s I had saved since I turned 16. When I stepped off the porch, the wind nearly knocked me sideways. The streets were empty, powdered white, street lamps buzzing under the weight of ice. Lakeview was quiet except for the storm and the distant hum of engines from cars that probably should not have been on the road. I tightened my grip on my backpack strap and walked because standing still felt more dangerous than moving. Inside my chest, something cracked. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was a quiet breaking, the kind that reaches the bones. Betrayal has a specific temperature. It feels colder than any winter wind because it comes from the people who were supposed to love you. It took me a long time to learn that what happened that night would shape every choice I made afterward. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to prove that being thrown away did not mean I was worthless. I walked past the dark houses covered in snow, past the yard where I used to chase fireflies with Rhea in the summer, past the mailbox Dad once helped me paint blue as a kid. All of it felt like a life belonging to someone else. The snow thickened by the minute, and my legs shook from cold and fear. At one point, I nearly slipped on a patch of ice and caught myself on a frozen trash bin, gasping as pain shot through my wrist. My breath came out in clouds that vanished instantly. The cold seeped into my bones. I knew I could not last long outside, so I kept my mind on the only place left for me, the only person who might open a door without asking questions. My Grandma Agnes lived miles away, but in that storm, it might as well have been another state. Still, I walked because there was nowhere else to go. Every step felt heavier. Every gust of wind made my eyes water until my lashes froze together. My throat burned from breathing in air that felt like shards of glass. My fingers were stiff, barely able to curl into fists. The snow blurred my vision, and the ground felt uneven under my boots. Somewhere along the long walk, the numbness began to outgrow the pain. That scared me more than anything. Numbness meant danger. Numbness meant my body was giving up. I clung to the thought of my grandma's porch light, the way it always looked warm, no matter how cold the night was. I imagined her fussing over me, telling me to warm my hands by the stove. I imagined someone finally saying they believed me, even if she was the only one. The world dimmed at the edges as I trudged forward. My legs were trembling by the time I reached her street, and I could barely see straight. The wind roared between the houses like it wanted to swallow me whole. I reached the steps of her porch and grabbed the railing, pulling myself up with whatever strength I had left. I lifted my hand to knock. I remember my knuckles touched the door. That was all. The next moment, everything slipped away. The cold finally won. My body gave out on the porch of the only person who had never turned her back on me. And as the darkness closed in, the last thing I felt was not fear. It was something closer to relief, because even half-consciously, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be, right at the edge of a life I had not yet imagined. That is where everything truly began, though I did not know it yet. When the darkness lifted, it was not gentle. It felt like someone was pulling me up from the bottom of a frozen lake. My eyelids were heavy, and my thoughts were floating somewhere far away. But I could hear a voice calling my name. First faint, then sharper, then warm with fear and relief tangled together. I recognized it before my eyes opened. Grandma. Her voice had always carried that steady strength, like she could handle whatever storm came through her door. I tried to answer, but only a small sound escaped my throat. The blankets around me were soft and thick, and heat pressed into my skin from every side. For a moment, I could not remember why my body hurt, or why everything felt distant. Then it returned all at once. The storm, the cold, the long walk, the door slamming behind me. My lips were cracked, and my tongue felt swollen. I swallowed and tasted the faint bitterness of fever. Gran leaned over me with a washcloth that smelled faintly of lavender and menthol. She dabbed my forehead and cheeks while shaking her head the way she always did when she saw something that made her angry, but she was trying not to show it. She told me I was burning up and I had been half-conscious on her porch when she opened the door. She said my clothes were soaked through, my hair was frozen at the ends, and I wanted to tell her I had tried to make it to her sooner, but the storm had swallowed the streets, and my legs had stopped feeling like they belonged to me. When I tried to sit up, my body protested. A sharp ache spread through my back and shoulders, the kind that comes from pushing yourself far past what you think you can bear. Gran put her hand on my arm and told me to lie back down. Her voice, and for a moment, I almost let myself believe I had been careless. But then the memory of my phone sitting dead in my backpack surfaced. I whispered that I could not charge it because the power at the house had flickered early. The truth was simpler. Even if I had a working phone, I did not know what to say. I had not known how to explain the look on my dad's face, or the way my mom held the railing as if refusing to move was easier than speaking. Grandma listened without interrupting, and her eyes softened even more. She said she understood. She said when someone makes you feel like you do not belong in your own home, your first instinct is not logic. It is survival. She brushed my hair back and tucked the blanket closer around me, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The room was dim except for the small lamp beside the bed. The house felt safe in the way warm kitchens and heavy quilts feel safe, with old photographs on the walls and the smell of laundry detergent hanging in the air. It felt like the opposite of the place I had just left. The fever made time stretchy and uncertain. I drifted in and out, hearing the storm outside rattle the windows. The sound was a dull roar that rose and fell like an ocean tide. Each time Grandma was either sitting beside me or moving quietly in the hallway, checking on me. She gave me water in small sips, helped me take off my wet clothes and slip into dry ones, and wrapped a heating pad against my feet. My hands were still stiff, and when I tried to bend my fingers, a deep ache shot through them. She warmed them between her palms until they tingled back to life. As my mind cleared, humiliation settled in my chest like a weight. It was not only the cold or the fever. It was the image of me standing on that porch, begging for someone to listen. It was the way my dad refused to look at me as anything other than a problem to remove. It was the silence on my mom's face and the way Rhea could not meet my eyes. The humiliation did not come from guilt. It came from knowing their version of the story mattered more to them than I did. I pulled the blanket closer and stared at the ceiling. The house creaked softly in the wind, and the sound reminded me of the nights I had slept there as a child. When I felt steady enough to speak, I told Grandma what had really happened, how Julian had cornered me one afternoon and said things that made my skin crawl, how I had tried to tell Rhea first because I wanted her to hear it from me, not from gossip. How she had defended him so aggressively that it left me stunned. And whatever he told her became the truth she delivered to my dad. Grandma listened with her arms crossed loosely, her jaw tightening as I talked. When I finished, she nodded slowly. She said she had seen this kind of thing before. She said people often believe the story that hurts the least. My dad could believe I was manipulative or jealous, because that required no change. Believing Julian had done something inappropriate would force him to rethink his trust, his pride, maybe even the family he thought he had built. So he chose the version that kept everything simple, except it had not been simple for me. It had been devastating. As the fever eased, I tried to sit up again. My head spun, but the room stayed stable. Gran brought me a cup of warm broth and helped me hold it so I did not spill. The heat slid down my throat and filled my chest with a slow, spreading comfort. She told me she needed to make a phone call, and she would be right back. When she stepped into the hallway, the old floorboards creaked under her careful step. I listened. Her voice was low at first, then sharper. I could not hear every word from where I was, but I recognized the tone. It was the same tone she had used when she dealt with unfair teachers at school, or people. She asked my parents why they had not called her to tell her their daughter had disappeared in a storm. She asked why no one had checked to see if I was safe. She asked why they were willing to believe the worst part of a lie instead of the simplest part of the truth. I held my breath. I waited for answers, but even from the bedroom, I could tell the answers were weak. Defensive. My dad's voice rumbled through the line, muffled but hard. He said I had chosen this. He said I had shamed the family. He said that until I was ready to apologize for lying, he had nothing to say to me. Mom's voice was softer, apologetic, maybe even unsure, but she still repeated what he said. It cut deeply because it proved what I had sensed all along. Their loyalty to a narrative mattered more than their loyalty to me. When Grandma came back into the room, she looked exhausted and furious in a quiet way. She sat at the edge of the bed and took my hand gently. She told me she had tried. She told me she pushed them hard. She told me they made their position clear. My heart sank, but I also felt something settle inside me, a strange mixture of grief and clarity. I did not ask her what came next. I already knew. If the people who were supposed to love me refused to hear me, then the only direction left was forward. As the hours passed, I drifted between sleep and awareness. The fever eventually softened into a dull warmth. My skin stopped burning. The throbbing in my temples eased. I watched the shadows move across the walls as the storm outside slowly weakened. The wind quieted, and the heavy blanket of snow against the windows now glowed faintly as the sky lightened. When I tried to stand for the first time, my legs felt rubbery and uncertain. Grant helped me to the bathroom, supporting my elbow as if I was made of glass. I washed my face and stared into the mirror. My cheeks were pale, except for 2 feverish spots of pink. My eyes were red and swollen from the cold and crying. I looked like someone I barely recognized, a girl caught between childhood and adulthood, bruised not by fists, but by betrayal. Back in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my hands together, feeling the warmth finally return to my fingers. My backpack sat on the floor where Grandma had placed it. The zipper was slightly open, and I could see a corner of the notebook I used for homework and half-formed plans. It was strange to think that everything I owned at that moment could fit into a single bag. It made me feel small, but it also made me realize how little I had left to lose. I spent the rest of the day recovering, drinking warm tea and nibbling on toast while Grandma checked my temperature. She asked if I felt steady enough to talk more about what happened, but she never pushed. When I was ready, I told her everything in full detail. I told her how Julian had acted, the words he had used, the discomfort that spread across my skin like a warning. I told her how Rhea refused to believe me and how the lie had grown until it swallowed the truth whole. Grandma listened with her hand resting on my knee. When I finished, she sighed and said she was sorry that I had carried all of it alone. She reminded me that truth has a way of rising eventually, even when buried. At the time, her words felt far away, like a distant promise made to someone else. I had no idea just how right she would be. As the light faded into evening, I lay back against the pillows. My body still ached, but the heat in the room wrapped around me gently. I could hear Grandma moving in the kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes, the whistle of the kettle. Everything felt steady again, even if only for the moment. I knew nothing about what the next day would hold. I only knew that I was safe for the first time since the storm began, and safety was enough. I closed my eyes and let my breath settle into a slow, even rhythm, feeling the weight of the day finally lift as I drifted back into sleep. When I woke again, the room was quiet in that soft morning way that makes everything feel gentler than it is. The fever had loosened its grip, and my breathing felt easier. Light came through the curtains in pale strips. For a moment, I just lay there, listening to the distant ticking of the hallway clock and the hum of the heater, working to keep the house warm. I did not know how long I had slept, but I knew by the ache in my chest and the heaviness in my limbs that the night before had carved something out of me that I would never fully get back. Gran stepped into the doorway holding a cup of warm tea. She had that look she often wore, the one where her eyebrows gathered just enough to show worry, but not enough to make you feel guilty for causing it. She asked how I felt, and I told her the truth, that I felt like someone had wrung me out and left me to dry. She smiled softly and said that was to be expected. I took the tea and wrapped my fingers around the cup, letting the heat settle into my hands. It felt like my body was finally agreeing to stay in the world. She sat at the foot of the bed and gave me a quiet moment before asking me if I wanted to tell her the whole story. Not pieces of it, not the version I had tried to make smaller the night before, but everything. I nodded because holding it inside felt like carrying wet sand. Too heavy, too cold, too sticky to move another inch. I told her about Julian first. I told her the comments he made when Rhea was not around. I told her how he stood too close, how he smirked when I backed away, How he made a joke at Thanksgiving that left me frozen in place because I knew exactly what he meant. I told her how I had tried to ignore him, how I thought if I pretended he was harmless, he might eventually lose interest. But then he cornered me one afternoon, just long enough to whisper something that made my stomach turn. I told him to back off. I told him he was crossing a line. He laughed and said I was imagining things. I told him I would tell Rhea if he did it again, and he said no one would believe me. Grandma listened without blinking, without frowning, without pulling back in suspicion. She sat still, the kind of stillness that comes from being fully present instead of shocked. When I finished the part about telling Rhea, my voice cracked. I told Grandma how Rhea had stared at me like I was rewriting reality on a whim, and how she defended Julian so quickly that I barely had time to finish the sentence. I told her how Rhea went straight to him, and how whatever he said to her poisoned everything afterward. Then I told her about the moment I walked through the door last night, the way my dad stood like a guard blocking the entrance, how my mom clung to the railing, how nobody seemed surprised. It was as if they had been waiting for me to arrive so they could deliver the verdict. Saying it out loud made my throat tighten. The betrayal sounded even sharper when spoken in the calm warmth of Grandma's home. She placed a hand on my knee and let the silence linger long enough for my breath to steady. Then she told me something I did not expect to hear. She said she believed me. Not in a hesitant way, not in a gentle way. I believe you because you are hurting. She said it with the firmness of someone who had walked through the same fire and recognized the burn pattern. She said that years ago, when she was young, she had been sent away from her own home for something she had not done. She said her first husband had twisted a story in such a way that made her look like the villain, because it was easier for him to deny the truth than to face the consequences of his actions. She said people love simple stories, even when they hurt the wrong person. Hearing her say that made something inside me unclench, like a knot that had been pulling tighter and tighter, finally loosening. I asked her how she survived it. She said you survive it because life keeps moving, whether you want it to or not. You survive it because there are still people who will see you clearly, even when the ones who should not. She stood up then and walked into the kitchen. I heard the old phone mounted on the wall as she picked it up and dialed. The sound carried down the hallway and reached me clearly. I sat there with my blankets pulled tight and listened to her speak with the kind of restrained fury that only comes from love. She asked my parents why they let me walk into a snowstorm. She asked why they did not call the police when I disappeared. She asked how they could believe I had tried to ruin my own sister's life when I had never once given them a reason to think I would do something cruel. My dad's voice rumbled through the line in muffled tones. I could not hear the words clearly, but I knew that tone. It was the same one he used on nights when he wanted to end a conversation before it began. It was the tone of finality. I felt my stomach twist even before Grandma came back into the bedroom. She sat down in the same spot at the foot of the bed and looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were tender, but there was a cold anger simmering just beneath the surface. She told me my dad insisted that I needed to apologize before coming home. He said I had shamed the family by lying. He said Julian was a good man and would never do something inappropriate. He said Rhea was fragile and I had upset her, and he would not tolerate disrespect. My mom apparently said very little. Grandma described her words as soft excuses floating between firmer statements made by my dad. I felt the sting of that. The silence from her hurt worse than anything. She had always chosen quiet over confrontation, but this time, her quiet was like a door shutting in my face. Gran told me she had made her own position clear. She said I would be staying with her as long as I needed. She said she told them she would not force me to apologize for something I had not done. She said she told them the truth would catch up eventually, and when it did, they would regret the way they had treated me. My chest tightened when she said that. It was one thing to think about it. It was another to hear someone else say it out loud. For a few minutes, I stared at the blanket on my lap, counting the threads, because it kept me from crying. The house around me felt warm and safe, but the reality of what happened gnawed at the edges of that safety. My own parents thought so little of me that they believed a lie without asking for proof. They did not need to hear my side. They had already made their decision. That was the part that lodged itself deepest under my skin. I took a deep breath and asked Grandma if she thought they would ever believe me. She sighed softly and said people only believe the truth when they are ready to live with the consequences of knowing it. She said my dad was not ready. She said he had built a world where his older daughter was the golden one, the reliable one, the one who never got in trouble. Accepting that she could be wrong would shake everything he relied on. Accepting that Julian could be dangerous would make him question his ability to protect his family. She said denial can be a powerful shelter, even when it shelters the wrong person. Her words made sense, but they did not ease the sting. The sting came from knowing my voice carried no weight in my own home. I felt like a ghost, drifting between walls that would not hold my shape. But sitting there in Grandma's bedroom, wrapped in warm blankets, and held by someone who believed me without hesitation, I felt the smallest spark of something new. It was faint, but it was there. A sense that maybe the truth did not need immediate belief to be real. Maybe survival was not about proving anything to them. Maybe it was about finding a place where I did not have to defend my existence. Gran helped me stand so I could move to the living room. My legs were steadier than earlier, though a tremor still ran through them. She guided me to the couch and brought another blanket, folding it over my lap with slow, deliberate care. The house smelled like rising dough and old books, two scents that always made me feel safe. The window beside the couch framed the outside world, still coated in heavy snow. The storm had quieted, but left behind an icy stillness. She sat across from me and asked if I understood that staying with her would mean no contact with my parents until they were willing to face the truth. I nodded. I felt the grief that settled deep inside. But I also felt a strange relief. I realized that going back there would mean shrinking myself just to be tolerated. It would mean pretending to be someone they could handle. And I did not want to live like that. Grandma spoke gently, telling me that sometimes being pushed out of one place is the only way to find another where you can breathe. She said it was not fair, and she said it was not right, but she also said it could become the beginning of something unexpected if I let it. I listened, unsure of how to feel, but grateful for her words. When the sky began to turn a darker shade of blue, she turned on a small lamp beside me and told me to rest again. I leaned back into the cushions and let my eyes close. My body still ached, and my heart still felt bruised, but the warmth of the room seeped slowly through the cracks. I fell asleep thinking about the road ahead, not because I had a plan, but because I finally understood I would have to build one. For the first time since the storm began, I felt the faintest suggestion of strength returning, like a whisper reminding me I was still here. The next morning came slower than I expected, a gray kind of quiet settling over the living room as I woke on the couch. My body still felt weak, but the fever had broken enough for me to sit up without feeling dizzy. Grant had left a folded note on the coffee table telling me that breakfast was on the stove, and that she had left early to help a neighbor pick up medication. Her handwriting always looked steady, like nothing in the world could rush her, no matter how heavy things were. I moved carefully, testing each step as if my legs might object. The oatmeal she left simmered in a small pot, still warm, and I ate a few spoonfuls before my appetite faded. The house felt safe, but the silence pressed differently now. It reminded me of everything I had lost in one night. School, friends, a future that had seemed predictable enough, a home, even if it had never been a gentle one. The weight of it all settled on my chest the longer I sat there. By the afternoon, Grant had returned with a grocery bag in one hand and her purse tucked under her arm. She asked if I felt strong enough to talk about school. I told her I could not go back to Lakeview High, not after what happened. She nodded like she had expected that answer. Then she suggested online classes, a way for me to finish the year without facing the eyes and whispers that were sure to appear. It felt like a lifeline I could actually grab. We spent the next hour at the kitchen table with her old laptop, setting up my enrollment in an online high school program. The process was slow and required more patience than I thought I had left. But Grandma guided me through it, one step at a time. When we finished, she gave a small, satisfied smile, the kind that warmed the air around her. I felt something settle in my chest, a steadying sort of gratitude. Within a week, I found a part-time job at a small bakery a few blocks from Grandma's house. I told them I could only work afternoons, and they agreed, without asking too many questions. It felt like a victory, the kind you do not brag about, but hold close to your heart. I spent my days helping in the kitchen, packing bread, wiping counters, trying to keep my mind busy enough that it did not wander back to the things I could not change. But news travels quickly in a place like Lakeview. Even when people act polite, their eyes say everything they are too kind to speak. I would walk into the grocery store and feel a hush settle, a quiet curiosity that burned at my spine. At the bakery, customers sometimes looked at me too long, like they were trying to see something written across my face. I heard whispers a few times when people thought I was out of earshot. Most of it circled back to my family and the drama around my sister's engagement. One afternoon, after I had finished my shift, I walked past the community center where a small nonprofit was hiring volunteers for weekend events. It was the kind of thing I had once dreamed of adding to my college applications. I stepped inside with a hopeful sort of excitement, but it lasted only a moment. The woman behind the counter, polite but brisk, asked for my name. When I told her, her smile thinned just enough for me to notice. She said the position had been filled earlier that morning, though the flyer on the wall still listed it as open. I thanked her and stepped back outside, the cold air hitting harder than it should have. I did not need anyone to explain what had happened. My family drama had reached the corners of the town where it did not belong. Someone had decided that taking a chance on me was too risky. I felt shame rise again, thick and suffocating, and I hated that it still had such an easy grip on me. That night, after dinner, I sat at Grandma's old desktop computer in the small office beside her bedroom. I logged into my school portal and finished an essay before opening my email. I stared at the blank screen for a long time, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then I began typing an apology to my parents. I wrote that I missed the house. I wrote that maybe there had been a misunderstanding. I wrote that I was sorry for upsetting Rhea. My throat tightened as I added lines that felt like they were stripping something away from me, one letter at a time. I knew they were lies. I knew apologizing for something I did not do would not bring peace. But I also knew that living in the shadow of their rejection hurt so much that I would have given anything just to stop feeling like an exile. I kept typing, even as a deep ache formed in my chest. Something inside me whispered that if I apologized, even falsely, maybe the town would stop looking at me like I carried trouble in my pocket. Maybe I could go back to being normal. Maybe life could return to what it used to be. The office door creaked then, and Grandma stepped inside with a folded basket of laundry. She saw the screen before she saw my face. She set the basket down and came to stand behind me. She did not say anything at first, just read the words I had typed. When she finally spoke, her voice was so steady that it made my hands shake. She said that apologizing for something you did not do was not an act of peace. It was an act of surrender. She said that once you decide to carry someone else's lie, you lose parts of yourself you may never get back. I kept staring at the screen because looking at her was too hard. She placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm, and said she had once apologized for something that was not her fault, and it had taken her years to recover her sense of self. Her words hit me with a force I did not expect. I felt the sting of tears gather in my eyes and tried to blink them away. She told me that surviving this storm would require strength, not silence, and that strength sometimes meant letting people be wrong about you. The idea of that scared me more than any snowstorm. Being misunderstood, being judged, being cast aside. But when she spoke, I felt something in me shift, small but unmistakable. I moved my hands back to the keyboard and hovered over the delete button. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel it in my throat. Then I pressed the key, and the words vanished from the screen in one clean sweep. It felt like releasing a breath I had been holding since the night I left my head. Parents' house. Grandma exhaled softly, like she had been waiting for that choice. She picked up the basket again and smiled as she walked out of the room. I sat there staring at the blank email draft until the quiet in the house settled, deep around me. There was still so much I could not control. The rumors, the judgment, the cold distance from my parents. But for the first time, I realized that the one thing I could control was whether I betrayed myself. And that night, at least, I had not. When I finally shut down the computer and turned off the office light, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. Not gone, but changed. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, wrapped in the soft sounds of the house settling for the night, and let the quiet guide me toward whatever would come next. I lay in bed longer than usual the next morning, listening to the house settle around me. The night before had left a kind of quiet strength under my ribs, something fragile but present. When I finally pushed the blankets aside and stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but steadier, like I had stopped waiting for someone else to tell me what came next. The years that followed did not arrive in clean chapters or easy steps. They came in long stretches of work and study and doubt. In the beginning, everything felt like walking uphill with no promise of a resting point. I balanced online classes with my bakery job, wake before sunrise to finish assignments, and then wiping down counters through the afternoon. Some days my body felt too tired to sit upright, but I told myself that once I finished high school, things would get easier. That thought pushed me through mornings when my eyes burned and my fingers shook from exhaustion. There was a stretch in the middle of that first year when I almost quit. It happened on a night when a storm knocked the power out at Grandma's house and erased an essay I had spent hours writing. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. Instead, I sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest and cried in the kind of quiet way you learn after too many disappointments. Grandma found me there and lit 3 candles, setting them on the table like small anchors in the dark. She told me hardship was not a sign that I was on the wrong path, but that I was building muscle I would need later. Her voice had a calm certainty that made me breathe again. I rewrote the essay from scratch that same night. By the time I earned my high school diploma, the bakery had become more than a job. It was the place where I learned patience and rhythm and how to keep going, even when no one was watching. The owner gave me extra hours, and when a new coffee shop opened nearby, he recommended me. That job paid a little better, and for the first time, I started to imagine a life where I could afford more than necessities. At 2016, I applied to a community college near Chicago. I held my breath as I clicked the submit button, convinced they would see through me somehow. But a few weeks later, an acceptance letter arrived in the mail. Grandma hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. I saved every penny, picked up extra shifts, and eventually moved to Evanston, Illinois, into a small one-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew off the lake. Signing the lease was both terrifying and thrilling. I stood in that empty space and felt something expand inside my chest. It was not freedom exactly, but it was mine. College came with its own challenges. Working part-time while taking a full course load stretched me thin. There were nights I fell asleep at my desk with my forehead on my textbooks. Nights I drank too much cheap coffee just to finish a paper. Mornings I felt so drained I wondered if I was built for any of this. But every time I considered stepping back, I remembered the night my dad locked the door behind me. I remembered the cold slicing through my coat, the way the snow swallowed my footsteps. I remembered how quickly people had believed the worst about me, and that memory pushed me forward. I refused to let the lie Julian told be the reason my life stopped. I studied marketing because I liked the balance between strategy and creativity. My professor saw that I worked hard, and occasionally one pulled me aside to offer advice or encouragement. Their support mattered more than they knew. In my second year, I landed an internship at a tech startup in downtown Chicago, a bustling place with open windows and a coffee machine that never seemed to stop running. The job was demanding, but it made me feel alive. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere that was not tied to my past. During those years, I heard almost nothing from my family. No calls, no messages, no holidays. Sometimes I thought about reaching out, but every time the urge rose, I remembered the sound of the door locking behind me and the way my dad's face had, twisted with certainty that I was to blame. That memory held me still. Silence sometimes hurts, but it also protects. Then one afternoon in 2018, I was in a cafe near campus studying for an exam when I overheard 2 women at the test, next table, talking about a winter wedding. I would have ignored it, except one of them mentioned a name I had not heard in years. Julian. My heart clenched so sharply I had to grip the table. They were talking about a ceremony in Lakeview, a big indoor event, because the groom's family wanted something traditional. They said the bride looked beautiful. They said her sister had not attended. Rhea had married him. She had married Julian, the man who had cornered me and twisted reality until my own family turned on me. I sat there staring at the steam rising from my mug, feeling a wave of something that was not quite pain, but not quite numbness either. More like the echo of an old injury that still knew how to ache. I waited to see if it would break me, the way it might have years before, but instead I felt a strange calm settle in. The kind of calm that comes when you realize a door you once tried to open is no longer part of the building. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not fall apart. Instead, I felt the smallest spark of relief. The moment I heard they married, I knew the apology I had once begged for would never come, and somehow that knowledge set me free. I finally understood that my life no longer hinged on whether they believed me. Their world was built on a lie, and no amount of truth would force it to shift unless they wanted it to. I closed my laptop and walked out into the cool afternoon air. Evanston's streets bustled around me, students darting across crosswalks, people carrying groceries, traffic humming like a steady heartbeat. I felt strangely light, as if some invisible tether had loosened. My past was still part of me, but it no longer decided the path in front of me. By 2020, I graduated with my marketing degree. The ceremony was held outdoors, and the wind off the lake made my gown flap around my ankles. Gran sat in the audience with her camera, waving so enthusiastically that several people around her laughed. When my name was called, she stood up and clapped like she had waited her whole life for that moment. Maybe she had. After the ceremony, she hugged me with tears in her eyes and told me she always knew I would find my way. I believed her. For the first time, I truly believed her. I found a job in Chicago a few months later, a junior marketing position that paid enough for me to upgrade to a slightly better apartment. The floors still creaked, but the windows stayed put when the wind blew. Through those years, the silence from my family remained steady. No updates from my parents. No calls from Rhea. Occasionally, I heard bits of news through old neighbors or mutual acquaintances. Nothing that made me reach for my phone. I realized that the girl who once stood shivering on a snowy porch, waiting for that door to reopen, no longer lived inside me. I had outgrown her. I had built something sturdier. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat on my couch with a bowl of soup and looked around my small apartment. It was filled with pieces of my life. The books I loved. The plants I kept alive despite my lack of skill. The framed photos of me and Grandma on graduation day. For the first time, I felt a contentment that was not fragile, a quiet certainty that I could shape my life on my own terms. I did not know then that everything I had built would soon be tested again. I did not know that the silence from my family was not permanent. I did not know that a phone call was coming, one that would pull me back into the past in ways I never expected. But that night, sitting alone in my apartment with the soft hum of the city outside my window, I felt strong in a way I had never felt before. I did not know it yet, but while I was building a life in Evanston, the lie that had torn mine apart was quietly starting to crack in the home I had once begged to stay in. It would take time for the pieces to reach me, but looking back, the unraveling had already begun, long before my phone finally rang. It started at Mercer Allied Sales, the company where Julian had built his picture-perfect reputation. For years, he had been praised for being reliable and level-headed, the kind of man bosses trusted and coworkers admired. But in early 2021, something shifted. A complaint was filed, the kind whispered about in hallways and copied into folders marked confidential. The investigation opened without warning. A female employee claimed that Julian had crossed boundaries with her more than once, and that she no longer felt safe around him. At first, the complaint stayed quiet, tucked behind corporate doors. But tension has a way of making itself known. Julian began coming home later and later. He stopped answering calls after business hours. He flinched whenever his phone vibrated. People talked, and talk traveled quickly. Even before official notices were sent out, everyone at Mercer seemed to know something was wrong. Rhea felt it before anyone else. She had always been attuned to Julian's moods, bending herself to fit whatever shape he needed. When he came home silent, she walked on tiptoe around him. When he snapped at her over small things, She blamed herself. Nights grew longer in their house. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, while he sat downstairs nursing a drink and scrolling through his phone with a tight jaw. The stress began to carve itself into her appearance. A hollow formed under her eyes. Her shoulders tensed whenever Julian entered the room. She stopped cooking. She stopped going out with friends. She stopped caring about things she once loved. Soon she began taking sleep medication just to rest a few hours without shaking. Herself awake. Julie Vane told her she was worrying too much, that the investigation was routine, that it would all blow over. But his words came clipped, and he never held eye contact for more than a second. Mercer placed him on temporary leave while they conducted interviews. His days at home grew tense and aimless. He paced from room to room, tapping through emails, muttering about coworkers trying to ruin him. Rhea tried to comfort him, but each gentle question she asked pushed him further into anger. Eventually, she learned to stop asking. She learned to fold worry into silence the way our mom used to do. It was around that time that Rhea stopped showing up for work at the medical billing office where she had been employed for years. She told her supervisor she needed time to deal with personal matters, and when the leave ran out, she came in only part-time. Then sporadically, then not at all. Each missed day added another layer to the pressure already building inside their house. My dad heard the rumors before he heard anything official. A friend of his from church mentioned overhearing something about Mercer, investigating inappropriate conduct. He brushed it off, calling it gossip. He said people were jealous of Julian's success. He said men in his position always had enemies. He said the world had become too sensitive, that innocent men were now targets. He said everything except the one thing that might have brought him closer to them: truth. But denial can only hold so long before strain begins to show. Even my dad could not ignore that Julian had stopped attending family dinners. He could not ignore that Rhea's voice shook when she spoke. He could not ignore that she had lost weight and kept her hands clasped tightly as if to keep herself from falling apart. Mom tried to soothe things by giving practical advice. She suggested therapy, suggested vitamins, suggested prayer groups, suggested anything that did not require facing reality. Her silence had always been her shield, and she clung to it tightly. She said she believed Julian was a good man, because believing otherwise meant accepting that she had misjudged someone she had welcomed into the family. She had built her world on her husband's opinions, and questioning Julian meant questioning my dad's certainty, which she would never do. Everything simmered under the surface until it finally bubbled over in small ways. Rhea snapped at my mom for asking if she had eaten lunch. Julian yelled at Rhea for misplacing a receipt. My dad slammed a cabinet door hard enough to crack the wood after Rhea mentioned needing help with a bill. Mom cried in the bathroom and said nothing when she came out. The investigation moved slowly, but its presence never left their home. One afternoon, my dad came back early from running errands and found Rhea sitting at the kitchen table staring into space, her hands trembling. When he asked what was wrong, she broke into quiet sobs. He tried to comfort her, but she kept repeating that she was tired, so tired, and she did not know what to do anymore. My dad froze. This was not the daughter he had raised. This was not the daughter he had chosen to believe over me. He asked her directly if something had happened at work with Julian. She hesitated. It was the smallest pause, but it landed like a crack in glass. She wiped her eyes quickly and shook her head, insisting she was fine. He let it go. But that pause stayed with him. Julian grew more irritable the closer the company came to reaching a conclusion. He blamed his coworkers, claiming they misunderstood innocent interactions. He cursed at the internal investigator over the phone. He accused Rhea of not supporting him enough. One night, he left the house for hours after she suggested he take responsibility for whatever part he might have played. When he returned, he was quiet, but the quiet felt dangerous. Mom called my dad into their bedroom that same night and told him she felt afraid of what was happening. She said she did not know how to help their daughter. She said something felt wrong in the house, wrong in ways she could not put into words. My dad told her to calm down. He said stress made people imagine things, but his voice shook. Still, he clung to the version of events he had chosen years earlier, the one where Julian was trustworthy and I was the problem, the one where the world made sense if he turned toward the daughter who never challenged him. The lie had held their family together for so long that untangling it felt impossible. But cracks grow whether you acknowledge them or not. When Mercer finally contacted Julian for a final interview, he stormed home furious, pacing so hard the floorboards trembled. He accused the company of trying to ruin him. He accused the woman who filed the complaint of lying for attention. He even accused Rhea of not defending him. She stood by the refrigerator, arms crossed tightly, eyes wide with something like fear. When he raised his voice at her, my dad stepped between them and told Julian to back off. It was a small thing, but it was the first time he ever placed himself between them. Later that night, Rhea disappeared into the bathroom for nearly an hour. When she came out, her eyes were glassy and red. Mom asked if she had been crying. Rhea said her head hurt, then went straight to the bedroom. My dad watched her go, with the slowness in his shoulders I had never seen before. That was the moment he began to ask himself questions he had avoided for years. He still defended Julian in conversation, but a shadow crept into his voice, a hesitation, a doubt big enough to frighten him. He asked Mom what she thought had changed in their daughter. Mom said stress can do strange things to a woman. My dad nodded, but he did not look convinced. Not long after, he overheard part of a phone conversation between Rhea and one of her friends. She was whispering fiercely, saying she could not keep pretending everything was fine, saying she did not trust Julian the way she used to, saying she could not sleep because the things he had done at work reminded her of something she had buried for years. My dad stopped outside the door when he heard the last part, reminded her of something she had buried for years. His hands trembled. There were not many things she could have meant. He whispered my name to himself then, barely a breath. The memory of that night, the snow, the accusations, the way he turned his face from mine. It rose like smoke he could no longer ignore. But even then, he did not call me. Doubt is uncomfortable, but guilt can be paralyzing. He carried both like heavy stones in his pockets. Still, he did not reach out. Instead, he paced the house late into the night, a man circling a truth too big to face. The lie that had held them together for so long was beginning to crack. And even though I was far away, living a life they never expected me to build, the pieces were already starting to fall toward me, one fracture at a time. He circled that truth like a man afraid to touch it. And while he paced the floors of the house I had once called home, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something quieter, but far more telling. The golden child of our family, the daughter who could do no wrong, had begun to fracture under the weight of the story she helped uphold. I did not see it in person, but later I would learn how it unfolded, piece by piece, through the people who still lived close enough to witness the unraveling. It started with small inconsistencies. A coworker of Rhea's ran into my mom at the grocery store and mentioned that Rhea had been taking far more sick days than anyone realized. Mom said she was surprised. The coworker said she was worried. Mom went home unsettled. Then Mercer Allied Sales widened its investigation. They began pulling internal emails, calendar entries, door key logs. They interviewed not only the woman who filed the complaint, but several others who had worked late hours near Julian. A pattern began to emerge, one that contradicted the polished image Julian had crafted. Meetings he claimed never happened showed up on security footage. Emails he swore did not exist were suddenly in corporate hands. Each new piece of information chipped away at the version of events Rhea had clung to for so many years. The tension at home rose like steam under a sealed lid. Every day held more silence, more strain, more trembling edges. Mom tried to hold everything together with soft reassurances and careful meals, but even she felt the shift. There were moments when she stared at Rhea with that searching look moms get when they suspect something is wrong, but do not know how to ask without breaking everything open. The crack finally showed itself on a morning in late spring. Rhea and Mom were in the kitchen. Mom was packing leftovers into containers, trying to make enough meals for the week because she could not trust her daughter to remember to eat. Rhea stood by the sink with her hands on the countertop, staring at nothing. The dishwasher hummed in the background. Mom asked gently if she had heard anything new from Julian about the investigation. She meant it as a simple question, something to open conversation without pressure. But the moment the words left her mouth, something in Rhea slipped. She said he had told her not to worry, that it would all go away, just like last time. Mom froze. Slowly, she asked what she meant last time. Rhea inhaled sharply, as if yanked back into her own body. Her shoulders tightened and she shook her head, murmuring that she had misspoken. But the damage was done. The words had left her lips already. Mom felt the meaning, like a stone, dropping into still water. Last time. Mom followed her into the hallway and pressed gently, asking what she meant, asking if something had happened before, asking if she had known about an earlier issue at work. Rhea denied it at first, then tried to dismiss it, but pressure does strange things to people, and her mask was already stretched thin. At some point, she simply stopped arguing, sat on the edge of the couch, and let out a breath that sounded years old. Mom sat beside her. She did not touch her at first. She waited. And finally, Rhea spoke. She said she had always believed Julian because she needed to believe him. She needed her marriage to be solid, needed her life to fit the image she had grown up trying to perfect. She said she had dismissed the first complaint he faced early in their marriage because he told her it was nonsense. She said she did not want to see the signs, so she didn't. She said she thought supporting her husband meant taking his side no matter what. She said she thought she was doing the right thing. Mom listened with wide eyes and a slow, trembling breath. She asked one question that would later echo through the house. Did that include the night your sister was thrown into a storm? Rhea went still, her hands clenched on her lap. She whispered that she did not want to talk about that. Mom pressed, gently but firmly. She said she needed to understand. She said the family needed clarity. She said she could no longer carry guilt without knowing what truly happened. And for the first time since that night, Rhea did not hide behind silence. She looked down at her hands and admitted she had believed Julian without question. She admitted he told her what I had supposedly done. She admitted she never asked me directly. She admitted she chose him because choosing him made her life easier. She admitted she ignored the discomfort in her own chest. She admitted she thought I was jealous and dramatic and trying to sabotage her happiness. Then, in a voice nearly broken, she said she knew even then that something about his story did not fit, but she did not want to confront it. She had wanted him to be good. She had wanted her future to remain intact, and she had wanted my dad to see her loyalty. Mom did not speak for a long time. She simply sat there, as if absorbing every word, like cold water soaking through heavy fabric. My dad had entered the room at some point and stood by the doorway, listening in absolute silence. He had not intended to eavesdrop, but something about Rhea's tone had stopped him in his tracks. Mom eventually asked the question that had been waiting for years. Did you ever doubt him? Rhea whispered no. Then after a few seconds, she corrected herself. She said she doubted him often, but she did not want to deal with what the doubts meant. She admitted she pushed those doubts down, layer after layer, until the night I tried to warn her. She said she chose to believe Julian because it was easier to believe the man she loved than to believe that her own sister would say something she did not want to hear. Mom wept quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just soft tears sliding down her cheeks as the reality she had avoided for over a decade settled into her bones. But the most striking reaction came from my dad. He said nothing. He did not defend Julian. He did not defend Rhea. He did not defend himself. He stood there with his hand gripping the doorframe, his knuckles white, his jaw tense, his eyes hollow. The silence stretched so long it became its own confession. He had nothing to say because he finally understood that every choice he made that night was built on a lie. A lie he never questioned. A lie he protected with the full force of his authority. A lie that cost him a daughter. The golden child who once stood shining in his eyes had cracked right in front of him. And he could not look away anymore. Mom wiped her face and asked Rhea if there was anything else they needed to know. Rhea hesitated again, then whispered something so faint Mom had to lean in to hear it. I was afraid she would take you away from me. Mom frowned. Rhea continued. She said she had always worried that I was stronger than she was, that people liked me more, that I could leave and build a life without anyone's approval while she needed validation she never quite received. She said she thought Julian chose her because she was the easier sister. She said she held on to him because he made her feel chosen in a way she had chased her whole life. Mom looked at my dad with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. This was not the daughter she had imagined she raised. This was not the confident, accomplished girl she thought she knew. This was a woman who had clung to a toxic relationship because it made her feel safe. Dad sat down heavily on the arm of a chair. He rubbed his temples and whispered something neither of them expected to hear. "I may have created this." Mom stared at him. She asked what he meant. He took a long breath and said he had always praised Rhea more loudly, had always treated her as the example, had always expected me to fix things quietly in the background. He said he thought he was encouraging excellence, but maybe he was carving roles into his daughters without meaning to. One golden, one overlooked. One praised, one blamed. He said he should have seen the sign. Mom reached for his hand, but he pulled away, not in anger, but in something that looked like shame. That night, the house felt heavier than it ever had. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no dramatic scenes. Just 3 people sitting with the truth they had avoided for more than 10 years. Julipan came home late to find them in the living room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken things. He looked at their faces and frowned, asking what happened. No one answered him. For the first time since he entered their lives, no one rushed to reassure him. No one tried to make him comfortable. He stood there waiting, but the silence wrapped around him like cold air. The golden child had cracked. The story they clung to had cracked. The certainty that once held their family together had cracked. And my dad, for the first time in his life, did not know how to put any of it back together. He would later tell me that this was the moment he realized the truth he had been circling could no longer be ignored. But at that moment, all he could do was stare at his family and feel the weight of the lie he once believed settle fully onto his shoulders. The next fracture would come soon after. The kind of silence could hold back. I was told later that the next fracture in their house came quietly, without warning, sometime before sunrise. My dad collapsed in the hallway on his way to the bathroom. Mom found him on the floor, unable to stand, his breath shallow and uneven. When the ambulance arrived, they said his blood pressure was dangerously low. By the time they reached the hospital, the doctors informed Mom that his kidney disease had progressed into its final stage. He would need dialysis immediately. His body had been failing long before anyone realized how bad things were. Julian did not go with them to the hospital. He said he had a meeting, something he could not cancel. Rhea arrived alone, looking exhausted and small inside her oversized coat. Mom sat in the waiting room, twisting tissues in her hands. She did not cry out loud, but her fear sat heavy in her posture. When the doctor finally spoke to them, the news was sobering. My dad's kidneys were functioning at a fraction of what they should. He would need regular treatments and possibly a transplant. They asked about immediate family for compatibility testing. No one said my name. Later, I would learn that during those hours in the hospital, something inside my dad crumbled. The certainty he carried his entire life had vanished. His authority had dissolved. The man who once stood firm enough to throw his daughter into a snowstorm now struggled to hold a cup of water without shaking. Watching him decline forced everyone around him to face truths they had avoided. Rhea could no longer pretend her life was intact. Mom could no longer hide behind the belief that everything would sort itself out. Julian could no longer rely on charm and denial. He began to isolate himself, spending hours locked in his office. At work, he was surrounded by scrutiny. At home, he was surrounded by silence. Rhea told Mom she felt like she was unraveling. She said she could not sleep in the same bed as Julian anymore. She said she felt sick whenever she heard his footsteps. She admitted she had been living with a kind of fear she did not know how to name. Mom tried to comfort her, but she could barely hold herself together. They sat in the hospital cafeteria for hours, whispering about things they should have confronted long ago. 2 days after he was admitted, my dad asked for his phone. Mom thought he wanted to call a cousin or a family friend. Instead, he stared at the screen for a long time before dialing a number he had not touched for more than a decade. My number. I remember exactly where I was when the call came in. It was early evening in my apartment in Evanston. I had just come back from work and was heating soup on the stove. When my phone buzzed, I almost let it go to voicemail. The name on the caller ID stunned me so completely that I froze with my hand still on the pot handle. Dad. Not an unknown number, not Mom, not a neighbor. Him. I picked up slowly, expecting anger or guilt or excuses. Instead, the voice on the other end sounded thin and fragile, like wind through paper. There was no command in it, no fire, no righteousness. It was a man, speaking from the edge of something final. He said my name quietly. He said he needed to see me. He said he knew he had no right to ask, not after everything, but he was asking anyway. His voice broke on the last word. I stood in the middle of my kitchen while steam curled from the pot, unable to speak. Part of me waited for the accusation, the scolding tone I had known for most of my childhood. But none came. He asked again, even softer, almost a whisper. He wanted me to come home. He wanted to talk while he still could. He said I did not owe him forgiveness. He just wanted a chance to say what he had never said. After we hung up, I sat down on the floor of my kitchen because my legs no longer felt steady. The past and present collided in my chest so sharply I could barely breathe. I remembered the door slamming shut on my 17-year-old body, the snow swallowing my footsteps, the cold sinking into my bones. I remembered the look in his eyes. How certain he had been that I was guilty. Now that same man was asking me to return. Later that night, I called Grandma. I told her everything. I expected her to tell me not to go. Instead, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took a long breath and said that the decision was mine, not his, not Mom's, not Ria's. Mine. She reminded me that going back did not mean returning to the life I once had. It meant choosing closure. On my terms. She said that sometimes facing the people who hurt you is not an act of forgiveness, but an act of reclaiming what they took. I lay awake for hours after that. My apartment hummed with familiar sounds. The refrigerator clicking on, the faint traffic from the street, the radiator hissing. All the pieces of my life were right there around me, built with years of effort, built without any of them. I thought about ignoring the call. I thought about sending a message saying I had moved on, but something in me knew this was a chapter that needed to be closed the right way, not left hanging open like an unanswered question. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I booked a train ticket to Wisconsin. The last time I traveled there, I had been a teenager shivering in a storm, walking alone through the dark with nothing but a few $100s in my pocket. This time, I carried my own strength with me. This time, I was not returning as someone seeking approval. I was returning as a woman who had built a life without them. When the train crossed into Wisconsin, the landscape outside the window felt both familiar and distant. The rows of pine trees, the frozen fields, the quiet streets leading into towns where time moved slowly. I watched it all pass by while a tightness grew in my chest. I wondered what I would say when I saw my dad. I wondered if words would be enough. I wondered whether he wanted closure or absolution. The hospital in Lakeview was smaller than I remembered. When I entered the lobby, the antiseptic smell hit me hard, reminding me of nights spent waiting with Grandma when she was sick. I followed the directions the nurse gave me until I reached the door to my dad's room. Mom sat beside the bed with her hands clasped in her lap. Ria stood near the window looking out at the parking lot. When they turned and saw me in the doorway, both froze. Mom stood up quickly and pressed her fingers to her mouth, tears forming instantly. Ria said my name in a voice I barely recognized. It was cracked, raw, stripped of everything that once made her the confident sister. But I kept my eyes on my dad. He looked smaller than I remembered. His skin was pale, almost gray. His shoulders that had once carried the weight of authority now sat sunken. When he saw me, something like relief washed over his face. He whispered my name again, this time with a tremble he could not hide. I walked into the room slowly, feeling the air shift around me. Mom stepped aside. Ria moved further back. I stopped at the foot of the bed and waited for him to speak. He reached for my hand. I did not take it right away. He swallowed hard and tried again. His voice quivered. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he believed the wrong person. He said he should have protected me. He said he had lived with that regret every day, and that it was breaking him apart. I listened, not because his words healed anything, but because I needed to hear them spoken out, loud. Mom cried softly. Rhea stood still, her face pale and tight. My dad waited for me to respond, his breath shallow, his eyes pleading. I finally placed my hand on the railing of the hospital bed, not close enough to hold his, but close enough to show I was there. I told him that I came because I needed to close this part of my life. I told him I did not come for reconciliation. I told him I was no longer the girl he threw into a snowstorm. I was someone entirely different now. He nodded slowly, accepting it. He whispered that he understood. That was all he wanted, to tell the truth before he ran out of time. I stood there, in the quiet of that hospital room, knowing that the next moments would shape everything that came next. I had returned, but not for them. I told him I had returned for myself, and for a long moment, no one in the room moved. The silence pressed in from every direction, heavy but strangely clear. I could feel Mom's breath catch. I could sense Rhea shrinking into herself near the window. My dad lay back against the pillows with his eyes closed, as if the truth had taken the last strength he had. But he nodded. He accepted it, and for the first time in my life, I felt the balance between us shift. He asked if I would come by the house before I left Wisconsin. He said he wanted to speak to me when he was awake enough to stay in the moment. Mom looked at me anxiously, as if afraid I would refuse. But I said yes. I did not owe them a reunion, but I owed myself an ending that belonged to me. 2 days later, Mom drove me from the hospital to the house I had not stepped into since I was 17. The drive felt shorter than I remember. I used to think the distance between my familiar world and that hospital room was vast. But now it seemed small, almost ordinary. Time changes the shape of memories. When we pulled into the driveway, I stared at the house that once held everything I thought defined me. The same blue siding, the same porch rail with the small dent from when Rhea and I crashed our bikes into it as kids. The curtains were drawn. The yard looked less kept than before. It was a strange thing, standing on the sidewalk and knowing that once upon a time, this place was the entire horizon of my life. Now it felt like a chapter I had already closed. Mom unlocked the door with shaking hands. She let me step in first. The air smelled the same, like laundry detergent and the faint scent of old wood. The hallway seemed narrower. The living room is smaller. I ran my fingers lightly along the back of the couch, half expecting the 17-year-old version of me to appear from the shadows. Rhea was sitting in the armchair near the window. When she saw me, she stood quickly, then hesitated. Her face looked tired, pale, worn in ways that went beyond lack of sleep. She whispered my name, but her voice cracked. I nodded to acknowledge her, but I did not walk closer. Mom touched Rhea's shoulder lightly, as if steadying her. Then she looked at me with a kind of sorrow that carried years in it. She started to speak, but stopped. She glanced toward the kitchen, and I followed her in. The kitchen was almost exactly the same. Same chipped countertop, same calendar hanging on the fridge, same humming light fixture that flickered on cold days. My dad used to stand at that counter drinking coffee every morning. He was not there now, but his presence still lingered. Mom took a seat at the table and folded her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She said she owed me something she should have given me years ago. She said she had stayed silent that night because she was afraid of breaking the family apart. She thought silence would keep the peace. She thought she could fix things later. She said she realized too late that her silence had not protected anyone. It had only caused harm. She said she was sorry. Deeply, truly sorry. She said the words as if they had been lodged in her throat for years. And now that they were spoken, she could finally breathe. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her something I had learned the hard way. Silence is not always kindness. Sometimes it is just distance dressed as gentleness. She nodded, tears falling down her face, and did not try to defend herself. Rhea stayed in the doorway, clutching the sleeve of her sweater. She seemed unsure whether she should approach or stay back. Eventually, she stepped into the kitchen and stood across from me. She tried to speak, but the words tangled. She said she did not know how to apologize for something that big. She said she wished she could go back to the night everything fell apart and choose differently. She said she believed Julian because believing him felt easier. She admitted she knew something was wrong, but was too afraid to confront it. Then she said she understood if I never wanted her in my life again. I looked at her for a long moment. I had imagined this scene countless times. Imagined shouting. Imagined her begging. Imagined a dramatic confrontation. But the woman in front of me was not the confident sister I remembered. She was someone who had collapsed under the weight of her own choices. I told her I did not need revenge from her. I did not need her pain to match mine. I did not need her to suffer. I only needed clarity, and I needed her to understand that my life had grown beyond the version of me she once fought to silence. My dad came home later that afternoon. Mom helped him through the front door, guiding him gently to the couch. He looked smaller than he had in the hospital. When he sat down, he motioned for me to sit across from him. He struggled to meet my eyes at first. When he finally spoke, his voice shook. He said he had chosen the easy road all those years ago. He said believing Julian required no effort. Believing me required introspection he did not want to face. He admitted he had always looked for neat explanations, even if they were wrong. He admitted he had not protected me. He admitted he had failed as a father. He said he had carried the weight of that failure every day. And he said he was sorry in a way that felt profoundly human, not rehearsed or dramatic, but worn and raw. Mom stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. Rhea sat at the far end of the couch, watching me with eyes full of regret, but not entitlement. None of them asked for forgiveness. They simply presented their apologies, fragile and uncertain, like offerings placed at the edge of something sacred. I told them the truth. I said their apologies meant something, but they did not erase the past. They did not erase the years I spent rebuilding myself alone. They did not erase the nights I cried because I thought I was unworthy of love. They did not erase the cold, the hunger, the shame, the fear. They did not erase the silence. I said forgiveness was not the same as returning. I said healing did not require reunion. I said I had become someone they did not expect, someone they no longer knew, and that version of me did not fit inside this house anymore. Mom cried openly. Rhea covered her face with her hands. My dad nodded slowly, accepting what I said, even though each word seemed to land like a heavy stone. I stood. The room fell silent. I told them I wished them peace. I told them I hoped they healed. I told them their world would not collapse if I stepped out of it again. Then I walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. When I stepped outside, the air was brisk and cold in a familiar way. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. For the first time, I felt no pull to look back. Not because I hated them, but because the chapter had finally closed in the only way it could. I walked down the driveway with steady steps, the weight inside my chest lighter than it had been in years. The past stayed behind me. The future waited ahead. And I kept walking until the house disappeared behind the curve of the street, until the wind no longer carried the faint scent of the past, until my breath came steady again. My rental car sat at the end of the block under a bare maple tree, its windows catching the late afternoon light. I opened the door, sat inside, and let the quiet settle around me. For the first time since I was 17, I felt the final thread connecting me to that house loosen. It did not snap with drama. It was simply released. On the drive back to Evanston, the landscape blurred into long stretches of winter fields and gray skies. I did not reply to the apologies. I did not rehearse the words I had spoken. I just breathed. Every mile I put between myself and Lakeview felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had once lost. By the time the Chicago skyline came into view, glowing against the horizon, a calm certainty rested inside me. I had done what I came for. Not to mend, not to punish. Too close. Life did not pause while my family unraveled. Within a few weeks, the consequences of years of denial unfolded in ways none of them could avoid. Julian's investigation at Mercer Allied Sales concluded. He was terminated for inappropriate conduct, and his professional reputation followed him into every interview and every reference check. The company worded it carefully, but people in the industry talk. And men who lose their jobs under those circumstances rarely recover. His confidence fractured, his arrogance dimmed. For the first time, he was held accountable by someone other than the people he manipulated. It was not revenge. It was reality. Ria eventually moved back in with my parents for a short time. She said she needed space away from Julian, space to think, space to breathe. But space does not erase truth. She woke up every morning with the knowledge that she had chosen the wrong side. She went to sleep every night knowing her loyalty had cost her a sister. She had years of work ahead of her, not the kind measured in apologies, but in rebuilding herself without the man she loved had once used as a shield. My dad continued dialysis. Some days, he looked stronger. Some days, he looked like a man trying to outrun time. Guilt became something he carried openly, not hidden beneath pride or stubbornness. Mom told me in a voicemail that he had started asking questions about what I liked. Now, what I did on weekends, whether I still drank the same kind of tea. She said he was trying, in small ways, to understand the daughter he had sent into the snow. But trying and repairing are not the same. There are some bridges that cannot be rebuilt, no matter how many planks you lay across them. Mom faced her own reckoning. She had spent decades relying on silence as a lifeline, believing it kept peace. Now she lived with the hollow of that quiet. She told me during one of our later phone calls that she realized her silence had not been neutral. It had been a choice that stranded her younger daughter alone in a storm, a choice that let lies grow until they consumed the people she loved. She said she carried that awareness every day. She said she hoped someday I would understand she was trying to change, not to earn forgiveness, but to live honestly for the first time in years. I told her I heard her. That was as much as I could offer. None of these updates changed the direction of my life. By the time I returned to Evanston, home felt like a soft landing. My apartment welcomed me with its familiar warmth and faint scent of cinnamon from a candle I had forgotten to blow out the week before. My desk sat where I left it, papers still arranged in gentle chaos. My job continued with its steady rhythm. My coworkers asked how my weekend went, and I smiled and said it was long. They nodded, unaware of the healing stitched inside those two words. A few months later, I met someone. His name was Aaron, a software analyst with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He held conversations like they were fragile things worth protecting. When we first started dating, I hesitated telling him about my past, not because I was ashamed anymore, but because the story felt like it belonged to someone I used to be. When I finally shared it, he listened without interruptions or judgment. When I reached the part about being thrown out into the snow at 17, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of it. Then he reached across the table and held my hand. Not to rescue me, not to fix anything, just to say he was there. Save love feels different when you have known survival love. It does not ask you to shrink. It does not demand sacrifice to earn something that should be freely given. It grows at your pace. It waits when it needs to. It shows up when it matters. As months passed, I found myself thinking less about the storm that changed everything, and more about the warmth that followed. About Grandma Agnes, who took me in without hesitation. About the nights she sat beside me while I rewrote essays by candlelight. About the strength she saw in me before I saw it in myself. I kept her photo on my desk. Every time I looked at it, I felt grounded again. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened if my dad had believed me that night. If Ria had questioned her fiancé. If Mom had spoken up. But wondering does not undo anything. It only reminds you that life follows the path people choose, even when those choices hurt. One evening, I walked along Lake Michigan with Aaron. The water was calm. The sky tinted gold. He asked me what I thought of my past now that some time had passed since my visit home. I told him it felt like a book I had finally finished. Not a story I wanted to reread, but one I was grateful to have reached the final page of. I told him the moment I closed their door behind me, I understood something I had never grasped fully until then. Their choices shaped the storm. Mine shaped the aftermath. He squeezed my hand. The waves rolled gently at our feet. The world felt wide again. Back at my apartment that night, I sat by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker against the dark. I thought about how far I had come since that night at 17, shivering on a snow-covered porch. I thought about the path that began with the words, "Get out," and led me to a life I had built from resilience, not approval. Getting out did not break me. It clarified everything. It showed me which voices mattered and which ones never deserved to shape my worth. It taught me that sometimes the harshest endings carve out the space for the truest beginnings. And if you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.